Hey everyone, welcome back to Dev Parkour. I'm Brian Parks, and I'm really excited about this episode. This is a topic that every project I've done, I've had to think about, and it's actually come up, even in my professional gigs, working for larger companies, because no piece of software that we build is going to be 100% built from scratch. Something that we do, we're going to want to leverage another library that someone else has produced, and we really need to pay attention to the licensing. One of the upsides of the absolute exponential growth of open source software is that there's just an incredible breadth of libraries and tools that we can build on top of that are out there. But one of the downsides is that that's come with a bunch of specific open source licenses that they're all different. And there are some attempts to decode these. So for some additional resources, you can go to opensource.org. That's the Open Source Initiative's main website. They have a really good write-up on far more licenses than I'm going to talk about in this video. I'm just going to talk about what I think are the biggest 6, and if you want to get technical, there are really only 5 that I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to break them into six licenses. And this also comes with the disclaimer: I am not a lawyer, I am a software engineer. This is just some guidelines that I've been using for the past, 8 or so years as I've been building software for other people when I've had to think about this stuff. And this is based on also what I've seen other people take into account when they're making the decisions like this. Of course, if you're at a company, talk to your legal team, consult with your architects, whatever the process is at your company, to make sure that something that you're planning on using has a license that the company is comfortable using. So with that, let's get right into it. So the first one that I want to talk about is the MIT license. And the MIT license is my favorite by far, because it's basically, again, I'm not a lawyer, it's basically, here is some code, you can use it for whatever purpose. I think there might be a provision in there that you can't use the original author's information to make it look like they promote or have blessed the project that you're building on top of it. But that basically means that you can use the code, you can make a derivative work, you can link to that library, you can bundle it all together if you're doing something like JavaScript. Not an issue. MIT is pretty permissive. It basically just protects the original author's copyright, and otherwise allows you to use the software for whatever you want, either for open source or for commercial activities. Next, there's the BSD 1 clause or 2 clause license. And the biggest difference between those two is, well, 1 clause. What that 1 clause is whether or not you have to include the license agreement and the copyright notice with binary distributions of the work. So if you distribute the source of either your software or the library that you're basing your work off of, you have to include the license and the copyright notice. If the software that you're using is licensed under the BSD3 Collapse license, you also need to include the license agreement. And of course, you could say this license corresponds to this library that we use, but even if you ship it as a binary, if you compile it yourself, or if you download the binary from the official sources or from somewhere else, potentially, whether you ship it as source or as binary, you have to include the license and the copyright notice indicating that that particular piece of code is licensed under the BSD3 Collapse license. Then there is, and just like MIT, you can use it for open source stuff or for commercial closed source stuff. Next up, the BSD3 Collapse license. And The BSD3 Collapse license is exactly like the BSD 1 and 2 clause licenses. It still has those first two clauses where if you ship the source or the binaries, you have to include the license and copyright notice. But additionally, it says that you can't use the original author's name and information as part of your promotion of your product. You can't say that the author of the thing you're using is directly supporting what you've built. Which again, I don't think that's an issue for most people. Most of us are not going to go use a library and then say, "Oh, the library author, thinks my product is awesome." I don't think that really makes sense from a marketing perspective. But that license specifically says that you can't use their name in conjunction with the promotion of your product. Yeah. So then next up, we'll talk. If I can get the piece of paper here, we'll talk about the Apache license. So Apache, most of us have probably heard Apache in reference to one of the more common web servers that are in use on the internet. Most people just refer to that web server as the Apache web server. Technically, that's the Apache HTTP daemon. So the project is actually HTTP or HTTPD, and the organization that supports it is the Apache organization, the Apache Foundation. Apache, we call it Apache. But Apache has many other projects that it kind of has stewardship of. Another one that you might have heard of, especially recently, is Kafka. That's another Apache project. And I want to say most, if not all, of the projects that the Apache group manages and runs and maintains are licensed under their specific license. It's very similar to some of the other licenses in that it is very permissive. It's much longer, and it's been a long time since I've actually read through the entire contents of it, but I know it is friendly to commercial endeavors in one form or another. I'm not sure if you can actually take the code and make it a truly derived work where you have added to the actual code base, but you're certainly more than capable, more than permitted to use the result of that code. You can certainly link to that code and not have any issue in a commercial setting. Of course, if you're doing an open source project, then you're totally fine. All four of the licenses that we've already talked about have no requirement that you use the same license to license your derivative work. That's going to change when we get to these next two licenses. So let's start with the one that everybody loves to hate, and that is the GNU GPL, or sometimes it's just referred to as the GPL. This is the General Public License. This is the license that most of the GNU software that you'll find on, say, Linux machines is licensed under. And this is, especially to commercial endeavors, this is a very frustrating license because it specifically requires that anything that you build be licensed under the GPL or a compatible license. And the biggest thing is that anything you build on it also has to be open source. They would prefer that you license your stuff also under the GPL, but at the very least, it has to be licensed under something that allows, they call it the four freedoms. So between you can use the software as you see fit, you can modify the software if you need to, you can distribute the software to other people, and they can modify it as they see fit, which means that your modifications, your derivations need to also be open source so that they can take advantage of that last freedom. This is more common among the binaries, the executables. So like, the tar program, for instance, the GNU implementation of tar is licensed under the GPL. I'm 99% sure. But this causes a problem for libraries, because what happened was there was kind of a nuance between, well, if I link against a piece of software, is that considered a derivative work? The GPL says yes. So if you use a GPL licensed library, that automatically means that your new product, even though it just links to the GPL software, needs to be GPL, which is kind of frustrating and really hamstrings people. So enter the LGPL, the GNU Lesser General Public License, which was intended kind of to solve that problem. So basically, it's the exact same license, but with that linking restriction more clearly defined. And the idea is that you can safely, you can create a piece of software that links against something licensed under the LGPL, and you don't have to license your software under the LGPL or the GPL as long as you don't change the interface between the library and your own. Basically, what that means is that people who use your application don't have to use a specific version of the library you linked against, or a specific implementation of the library you linked against. So they can choose to make modifications, if they so choose, to their copy of the LGPL software, and it will still work with your software. So that's the important distinction. Now, there is one that I didn't mention, which I probably should have. There's one called the Affero GPL, the AGPL. It's kind of like the GPL, but as the prevalence of the web increased, there was a kind of a loophole in the GPL where it kind of, what did it mean to distribute software? If you built software and put it onto a web server and people used it, was that considered distributing your software? And most people say no. You deployed your software to one place. I mean, anyone who has access to that one place has access to the code, sure, but there's no requirement that users have access to that source code. The AGPL kind of clarified and closed this loophole and said that if you use something that's licensed under the AGPL in a product that's made web accessible, users can use it via a web browser. Your code that is built on top of the AGPL licensed product also needs to be open source. So if you see AGPL and you're planning on building a commercial product, definitely run the other way. If you're planning on building a web application and you see GPL, you're probably okay. If you're planning on distributing a desktop application and you see GPL, you're gonna have to make your product open source. LGPL, watch the nuances. There are definitely some nuances that you want to make sure you don't fall into those traps. The other four, MIT, Apache, BSD, any number of clauses, you should be okay. Again, check with your legal team to make sure that you're not, falling into any particular traps with that. But you should probably be okay if you're planning on building a commercial product. And even the same goes if you're planning on building an open source piece of software. If you have a piece of open source software and you link against something that's GPL licensed, for instance, you can't redistribute that under the MIT. And you certainly can't take a piece of GPL software, make modifications to it, and then relicense the complete package under MIT. You might be able to release your modifications under MIT, but you have to be careful how you do that. You might have to play some games, like only distribute your changes as a patch file, for instance. So technically, you're releasing something that isn't useful by itself, but other people are making modifications to their GPL copy by using what you've produced and licensed under the MIT license. Licensing is very tricky, super complicated. I don't blame you if you didn't sit through the last 2 minutes, but hopefully this was helpful. If it was, go ahead and leave a like on the video. comment down below with some of your questions, and hopefully I'll be able to answer them. If you are a lawyer and have other suggestions, feel free to, give guidance or, point people in the right direction toward other more official resources on this. Again, I'll leave a link to the Open Source Initiative's website down below, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more like this, and click that notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.